Walter Gaines had $14.22 in his checking account the morning he walked into First Meridian Bank and asked for a loan. $14.22, Venetians. He knew the exact number because he had balanced that account by hand every Sunday night for 55 years the way his father had taught him, pencil to ledger, no errors allowed. The $14.22 was what remained after he had paid the fuel bill, the property tax installment, and the quarterly premium on his tractor insurance. It was not a mistake. It was not poverty. It was just where the money sat on a Saturday morning in April in a small account Walter used the way other people used a wallet. He had other accounts, but the man behind the desk at First Meridian Bank did not know that yet. Walter drove the 7 miles from his farm into Clover Falls in the same 1991 Ford pickup he had driven since the Clinton administration. The truck's blue paint had gone chalky with age, faded to something closer to the color of old denim than anything you could call blue anymore. The tailgate had a dent from a fence post incident in 2009 that he had never bothered to fix because the tailgate still opened and closed, and that was the point of a tailgate. The passenger seat had a permanent hollow worn into it from decades of Eleanor sitting in the same spot, her back straight, a paperback novel open in her hands, or the county paper folded to the crossword puzzle, her reading glasses sliding slowly down her nose until she pushed them up without looking away from the page. He had never adjusted that seat, never moved the small mirror she had angled toward herself. Some mornings he caught his own eye in it instead of hers and felt the absence the way you feel weather present and undeniable and larger than any room you try to contain it in. Eleanor had been gone 2 years. He parked in front of Ruth's Diner at 7:15, same as every Saturday for the past 31 years. The bell above the door chimed when he walked in. Ruth Dawson was already pulling the coffee pot from the burner before he reached the counter. She had the cup waiting at the third stool from the left, his stool, the one with the cracked vinyl and the padding gone flat from years of use by the time he settled onto it. "Morning, Walter?" She set the cup down. Black, no sugar, same as always. "Morning, Ruth." Usual. If it's not trouble. When has it ever been trouble? Ruth was 62 with gray, threaded through dark hair she kept pulled back on working mornings, and the particular calm of a woman who had seen enough of life's bad turns to stop being startled by them. Her daughter Sophie was at school most days, now had been for 3 years. There had been a time when that was not guaranteed. Walter knew about that time, though Ruth did not know he knew, and he had no intention of telling her. He ate slowly. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, a side of hash browns, Ruth always added without asking and never put on the ticket. He watched the main street through the plate glass window. A few cars passed. The town moved at a weekend pace on Saturday mornings, not empty, just unhurried the way small places are when the week's obligations have not yet reassembled themselves. The hardware store across the street was just unlocking. He could see Frank Hobson through the window, big square hands sorting something behind the register, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been opening that same door at the same hour for 4 decades and saw no reason to do it differently. Walter left $4 on the counter for a $2.50 breakfast. Ruth told him every week it was too much. He told her every week it wasn't enough. Outside, he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up the street toward the bank. The morning sun turned the glass front flat and white. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the wire frames folded there. Eleanor's reading glasses. Small, lightweight, slightly scratched on the left lens from a morning she had set them on the kitchen counter without noticing the edge of a pot. The nose pad on the right side had been replaced twice because she kept bending it without realizing. He carried them every day. Had since the morning 3 days after the funeral, when he had found them on her nightstand and understood in the sudden specific way grief arrives that she would not be coming back for them. "All right, Ellie," he said quietly, not loud enough for anyone passing to hear. "Let's go see what kind of man they've put in charge." He walked. His knees had opinions about cold mornings, but he did not carry a cane. Eleanor had told him once that a cane was fine, that there was no shame in it, but Walter had decided somewhere in his 70s that the day he started needing one to get around was the day the farm would start running him instead of the other way around, and he was not there yet. He kept his pace steady the 3 blocks from the diner to the bank and pushed through the glass door into the pale blue lobby. Margaret Hollis was behind the teller counter. She was always behind the teller counter. She had been there since 1994 when she had taken the job to help her then husband through graduate school, and then the husband had left and the job had stayed, and she had never quite gotten around to replacing either of them with something different. Gray hair pinned back, reading glasses on a chain. She looked up the moment Walter came through the door, and her face opened the way faces do for people they are genuinely glad to see. "Walter Gaines," she smiled wide. "Haven't seen you in here since January." "Didn't need anything in January. What brings you in today?" Walter glanced toward the glass-walled office at the back of the lobby. A young man sat behind a clean desk jacket on laptop open, moving through whatever was on the screen, with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to offices where efficiency was measured and noted. Dark hair, clean shave, a haircut that cost more than anything in Clover Falls charged for a haircut. That the new manager, something shifted in Margaret's expression, just slightly, just enough for Walter to read it. "Ryan Caldwell, transferred in from the regional office about 6 weeks ago." She paused for half a beat. "He's thorough." Walter understood what she was leaving out of that sentence. He had known Margaret for 30 years. He knew the difference between what she said and what she meant. "I'd like to talk to him about a loan," Walter said. The shift behind Margaret's eyes went deeper. She knew Walter's accounts, all of them, the way you know things you have watched build themselves from nothing across 3 decades. She knew the trust balance the way she knew her own address, had watched Eleanor come in month after month, with deposits that ranged from $50 to $500, depending on what the farm had left over, had watched the number grow from a modest beginning to something that still surprised her sometimes when she pulled up the screen. She understood precisely what a $5,000 loan request would look like to a man who had been at this bank for 6 weeks and had not yet read anything beyond the main profile. "Walter," she said carefully, "you sure about that?" "I'm sure." She held his gaze for a moment, reading whatever was in his face, and then she seemed to arrive at a conclusion and picked up the phone. She pressed the extension for the back office. "Ryan, I've got a customer here who'd like to discuss a loan. Walter Gaines. He's been a depositor for over 50 years. She hung up and nodded toward the back. "Go on in." Walter crossed the lobby. His work boots left faint scuff marks on the carpet. He knocked once on the open door frame. Ryan Caldwell looked up from his laptop and stood in one smooth motion, extending a hand across the desk. Firm grip, practiced smile. Professional in the way that people become professional when they have trained for it rather than grown into it. "Mr. Gaines, please sit down. What can I do for you today?" Walter lowered himself into the chair across from the desk. Modern chair, chrome arms, thin cushion. He placed his hands flat on his knees. "I need a loan," he said. $5,000. My combine needs a new cutting head before the harvest season." Ryan nodded and turned to his computer. His eyes moved across the screen. His expression stayed carefully neutral, but his typing slowed in a way that told Walter the number had appeared. Walter watched him see the $14.22. "And what collateral would you be offering Mr. Gaines?" "My word." A pause. Ryan cleared his throat. He adjusted a pen on his desk, the gesture of a man choosing how to arrange his next sentence. "I appreciate you coming in, but based on what I'm seeing here, your checking account shows $14. Your savings has just over $800. At your age, without a verifiable income source in our system." He set the pen down. "I can't approve this. The numbers aren't there to support an unsecured loan." He paused again. "We do have a county senior assistance program. I could pull the paperwork if that would be useful." The room went quiet. Walter looked at Ryan Caldwell for a long moment. Not with anger, not with wounded pride. He looked at him the way a man looks at something that has been placed in exactly the wrong position, not with malice toward the thing itself, but with the clear recognition that it is simply in the wrong spot. A gate hung on the wrong post. A fence line set a foot off the property boundary. The error was not personal. It was just there. "Thank you for your time," Walter said. He pressed his hands to the armrests and pushed himself up. His right knee locked for half a second the way it always did in the morning, then released. Ryan stood too reflexive, courtesy the training kicking in. "Mr. Gaines, if your situation changes—" "It won't," Walter said quietly. He walked out of the office across the carpet to Margaret's counter. She had been watching through the glass the entire time. Her jaw was set in the way of a woman holding herself to a particular standard of composure. "About how you expected. Walter said, keeping his voice low. The lobby was nearly empty, one other customer near the far window. A woman bent over a deposit slip, her back mostly turned. Walter, I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry about, Margaret. He leaned against the counter. Pull up the trust account. She looked at him. Her expression was not surprised. She had been half expecting this from the moment he walked through the door, but something more complicated than surprise. The face of a person who understands exactly what they are about to do and has decided after a brief interior argument that it is the right thing. You sure? She asked. I'm sure. She turned to her terminal. She knew the account number from memory, the way she knew the birthdays of her grandchildren. The screen changed. She looked at it, looked at Walter, and he nodded once. She turned the monitor not toward Walter but at an angle, toward the glass office behind him, toward Ryan Caldwell, who had already settled back into his work and was reaching for his next file. The Walter and Eleanor Gaines Family Trust. Balance $11,847,290. For a few seconds, nothing changed in the lobby. The air system hummed. A car moved past on the street outside. The woman at the deposit slip kept writing. Then Ryan looked up. His eyes found the monitor. He squinted across the distance, not quite believing what the screen was showing him. He stood slowly. Walter did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Margaret. I didn't come in for the money, he said. His voice was even and low. The voice of a man saying something he has known for a while and is now simply making audible. I came in to see the man. Margaret's eyes were wet. She did not cry. She just nodded one small, definite nod. I'll be back Monday, Walter said. I need to talk to someone about moving a large sum. Not with him. He tilted his head slightly toward the back office. Not yet. Behind him, Ryan had come to the doorway of his office. The blood had gone out of his face. He stared at the number on Margaret's monitor, then at Walter's back, then at the number again. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Walter tapped the counter once with his knuckle, the way you knock on a door when you are leaving rather than arriving, and walked toward the exit. The bell above the door chimed behind him. Margaret turned the monitor back to its normal position. She looked at Ryan, still standing in his doorway with his hand on the frame. I told you to read the full file, she said. She turned back to her screen. The conversation was over. Walter sat in his truck in the parking lot without starting the engine. The lot was mostly empty, a few cars, a delivery van, double parked at the end of the row. He reached into his shirt pocket and held Eleanor's glasses in both hands, the wire frames cool against his palms. A sparrow landed on the hood of the truck and regarded him through the windshield with the mild indifference of small birds. He's not a bad man, Ellie, Walter said. The sparrow hopped once, twice. He's just a man who stopped looking before he finished looking. Different thing. He turned the glasses in his hands. I've been thinking about the center. I know you said to wait until I have found the right people. I think I've done enough waiting. The sparrow spread its wings and was gone. Walter put the glasses back in his pocket. He started the truck, it coughed, once caught, settled into its familiar idle, and pulled out of the lot and drove east toward the farm. The fields came out on both sides of the highway, almost immediately green and flat, and extending far enough that the tree lines at their edges were just suggestions. His fields. 400 acres of soybean and corn, and behind the creek on the back 40, the test plots where he had spent the better part of the 12 years developing a drought-resistant soybean hybrid through patient, obsessive, almost private work. 6 generations of plants, soil chemistry, recorded in notebooks, with handwriting, small enough to require a magnifying glass cross-pollination schedules mapped out in pencil on graph paper. A major agricultural company had come looking for new genetics in the early 2000s. And Eleanor had negotiated the licensing agreement across a kitchen table while Walter stood by the window and let her handle the numbers because she was better at numbers than he had ever been, and they both knew it. Nobody in Clover Falls knew about any of it. That had always been the point. Eleanor had been an accountant before they married. She understood money the way Walter understood soil, not as a destination, but as a medium, a thing that responded to patience and attention, and the discipline not to touch it before it was ready. They had built something enormous together without making a sound about it. The mineral rights on the back 40 sold in 2003 for $3.1 million when Eleanor insisted on getting the land surveyed after reading a single paragraph in the county agricultural report about gas deposits in the region. Walter would have let it go. Eleanor would not. Then the seed patent with royalties coming in every year since the licensing agreement. And Eleanor herself steady and unhurried for 50 years, taking whatever was not needed for feed seed fuel or taxes and putting it somewhere careful, watching it compound, reinvesting without drama or announcement. Until the principle alone was larger than anything their neighbors would have imagined if they had thought to imagine it. They never changed how they lived. Same house, same truck, same pair of work boots, Walter had resold twice. Eleanor used to say the money was not theirs to spend. It was theirs to use. There was a difference, she said, and the difference mattered more than the amount. Back at the farm, Walter parked and climbed out slowly. The neighbor's mutt had wandered into his driveway again and sat in a patch of afternoon sun near the porch steps, comfortable, as if it owned the place. Walter scratched its ear and went inside. On the kitchen table was a folder he had been assembling across 4 months of evenings. Architectural sketches on graph paper drawn in his own hand. He had never been a draftsman, but he had always been able to draw what he meant, and the sketches were clear, even if they were not pretty. Legal notes from conversations with his attorney in Millhaven. A photograph tucked inside the front cover, its edges beginning to curl the old community center as it had looked in 1998, red brick and white trim, the covered porch where people sat in folding chairs during the summer concerts Eleanor organized every June and July. She was in the photograph standing at the edge of the porch with a stack of books in her arm, laughing at something happening off to the left of the camera. The particular laugh she had when something genuinely pleased her. Open, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had not yet learned to moderate her own delight. The building had burned 4 winters ago. Electrical fire overnight. No one was hurt, but the old center was gone by morning, and something in the town went quiet afterward in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel. The reading programs that Eleanor had run for 15 years stopped because there was no place to run them. The Thanksgiving dinner stopped. The Tuesday evening accounting class that she had offered to anyone who wanted to come, teaching people to balance a checkbook, read a mortgage document, understand a tax return, practical things that she said everyone deserved to know, that stopped too. The lot behind the post office became a patch of crabgrass and volunteer weeds behind a sagging chain-link fence. Eleanor had talked about rebuilding it. She had talked about it for years before the fire and then more urgently after. And even in the hospital, in those last months when her voice had thinned and her hands had gone light in his, she had talked about it. He had slept in a chair in her room for 7 months. He had held her hand every day of those 7 months. And one afternoon in October, when the light was coming through the window at a low angle and she was having a clear day, one of the clear days that felt like gifts, she had looked at him with the full weight of herself and said, "Promise me, Walter, build it, not for me, for them." He had promised. He opened the folder now and spread the sketches across the table. Main hall, full kitchen, 2 meeting rooms, a storage room larger than the architect would probably think necessary, but every building needed more storage than the architect planned for, and Walter had learned this from observing 40 years of other people's underplanned buildings. And in the back corner, a small room off the main corridor. He had labeled it himself in pencil, pressing the letters carefully, Eleanor's reading room. He sat down and looked at the photograph for a while. Then he picked up a pencil and began adding notes in the margins of the sketches. Dimensions he had reconsidered, where the kitchen equipment would need to go, the shelving configuration for the reading room. He would call his attorney Monday. He would set up the charitable fund. $2 million from the trust properly structured with a small board of trustees to oversee the construction and the ongoing management of the building. The Eleanor Gaines Memorial Community Center. Her name above the door. He was still writing when the afternoon light moved past the window and the kitchen went dim. He did not get up to turn on a lamp. He just kept working, pencil on paper, filling in the details of something his wife had dreamed about in a quiet house in a town that did not yet know what was coming. By Sunday morning, the story had grown legs. The woman filling out the deposit slip, her name was Carol Bentley, a member of the First Methodist Church Choir, with sharp eyes and a generous way of sharing what she observed, had watched the whole exchange from the far window and understood enough of what she had seen to carry it to the church potluck that evening. By Sunday breakfast at Ruth's Diner, the story had reached 3 separate tables. By noon, it had traveled to the hardware store, the post office, and most of the porches on Main Street. By evening, it had made a full circuit of the town and was beginning its second. The numbers shifted with each telling. Some versions had 12 million. Others climbed to 25, then 50. One account had Ryan Caldwell on his knees in the lobby. None of the details were exactly accurate, but every version carried the same essential truth at its center. The old farmer, who wore the worn-out boots and drove the rusted pickup, had more money in the bank than anyone in Clover Falls had imagined, and the new bank manager had dismissed him without looking. Ruth heard 3 different versions of it before her Saturday breakfast rush was over. She stood at the counter after the last of the morning customers left, holding the coffee pot she had forgotten to put back on the burner, looking at the third stool from the left. His stool, his $2.50 breakfast, his $4 tip every Saturday for 31 years. She thought about a phone call she had received 5 years ago from the hospital billing office. The woman on the other end had spoken carefully, professionally, with the practiced gentleness of someone delivering unexpected news of an unusual kind. Mrs. Dawson, I'm calling to let you know that your outstanding account balance has been satisfied in full. Every bill related to Sophie's treatment, inpatient, outpatient, the specialist consultations, everything has been cleared by an anonymous donor. I'm afraid we're not able to say anything more than that. Ruth had asked, had pushed past the polite refusals and asked again because she was not a woman who gave up easily on things that mattered, and this had mattered more than anything. The woman on the phone had been kind and final in equal measure. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Dawson. We can't disclose that information. She had spent 5 years carrying a gratitude so large it had nowhere to go. 5 years of wondering, of looking at people differently, of trying to find some way to thank someone she could not name. She set the coffee pot down and looked at the stool, the $4 tip on a $2.50 breakfast. Every Saturday for 31 years, without variation, without explanation. She didn't know yet, but something in her chest was already forming the shape of a name. At the hardware store, Frank Hobson was sorting lag bolts into the correct bins when his cell phone rang. He looked at the screen, Connor Gaines, and answered on the second ring. Frank? The voice on the other end was controlled in the way that voices get when the feelings behind them are doing something more complicated than the words. Tight, careful. Connor. Frank kept his own voice easy, the same tone he used for customers who came in with a problem they hadn't quite figured out how to describe yet. Calling to check in on things. I heard something, Connor said. I imagine you did. Which version? The one where my father walked into the bank with $14 in his account, got turned down for a $5,000 loan he clearly didn't need, and then had the teller show the manager $12 million on a screen. A pause. Is that accurate? 11.8, give or take. And yes, Connor was quiet for a moment. Frank could hear the texture of the silence, the particular quiet of a man sitting alone somewhere, city sounds in the distance, the kind of stillness that is not peaceful. Why didn't he just tell them? Connor asked. Because your father isn't interested in telling people things. He's interested in knowing what they'll do when he doesn't. Frank set down the bolt he was holding. Connor, there's more you need to know. Go ahead. He's building a community center. Your mother's name on it. $2 million from the trust. The lawyers are drawing up the fund documents this week. He's been planning this for months, probably since before Eleanor passed. He promised her. The silence on the other end went different, denser, something moving in it that had not been there before. She asked him in the hospital, Frank said. The old building burned and she wanted it rebuilt. He's been carrying this since those last months, and he's doing it alone. You know he won't ask you to come. He's not built that way and never has been. But he shouldn't be doing this without his son there. Frank paused. Your mother would want you here. You know she would. Frank. Don't think about it too long, Frank said. Some things don't get easier the longer you wait on them. He hung up and stood in the quiet of his hardware store and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he went back to sorting his bolts. Connor Gaines sat at his kitchen table in Columbus for a long time after the call ended. The table was covered in papers he had been avoiding for weeks. Bank statements, collection notices stamped in the particular red that means the first stage of escalation has already passed. A letter from his attorney about a real estate investment that had gone wrong in ways that were still unfolding 6 months after the original collapse. He was 49 years old. He had lost most of what he had spent 25 years building, not in a single dramatic fall, but in the slow grinding way that financial ruin actually arrives, one document at a time, one unanswered phone call at a time, the damage accumulating quietly until it could no longer be called manageable. He had left Clover Falls at 18 with a clear intention, though he would not have named it that way at the time. The intention was distance, not from his parents exactly, not from them as people, but from the shape of the life, the farm, the truck, the boots, the smallness of a town where everyone knew everything about you and where the biggest aspiration available, as far as the teenage Connor had been concerned, was to do the same thing your father had done on the same ground he had done it on. He had wanted something larger, something that would look from the outside like success. He had built it. A business degree, then corporate consulting project management for companies large enough to have departments dedicated to problems he had once thought impossibly complex. Good salary, a city apartment, a life that looked from the outside exactly the way he had planned it to look. The real estate deal had been his own idea, his own capital, his own judgment, and the judgment had been wrong in the ways that had stripped him down to almost nothing. He picked up his phone and opened the airline app. There was a flight to the regional airport Friday morning. One way because two-way implied certainty about the return that he could not honestly claim. He stared at the booking screen for a while. He thought about his father sitting in that bank. He thought about his mother's reading glasses, carried in a shirt pocket every day for 2 years. He thought about the last time he had stood on the farmhouse porch the afternoon of Eleanor's funeral when he had needed to leave because staying had felt like something he did not know how to do, and he was ashamed of not knowing. And his father had raised one hand from the bottom of the porch steps as Connor backed the rental car out of the driveway. One hand steady and without reproach. Just a wave that said, without any drama, I see you going. Connor pressed the button. One way, Friday morning, he was going home. Walter spent Monday at his attorney's office in Millhaven. The law office was a small brick building wedged between a dentist's office and a barbershop, unremarkable from the outside in the way that useful things often are. He set the folder on the desk and explained what he wanted clearly and without preamble. A charitable fund, $2 million from the family trust properly structured for disbursement. A board of 3 trustees himself, Frank Hobson and Patricia Delgado, the attorney in Clover Falls whom Eleanor had trusted and who had helped them update the trust documents years ago. Construction oversight with quarterly accounting reviews and a full audit at completion. The fund to carry his wife's name. The building to carry her name above the door. The attorney read through everything for 20 minutes. Walter sat quietly and looked at the parking lot through the window. He had never been a man who fidgeted in silence. 55 years of farming had settled that out of him long ago. The seed did not care about your schedule. The weather made its own decisions. You learned to wait inside the waiting to find something useful to do with stillness rather than fighting it. Eleanor had always said that his patience was the thing she had loved first about him, not the quietness which some people found unsettling, but the quality of the quiet, the sense that it came from sufficiency rather than absence. This is straightforward, the attorney said, looking up. We'll have the documents ready Thursday. Walter drove back to Clover Falls, stopped at the lumber yard on the way through Millhaven to pick up concrete patch for a fence post on the north line, loaded the 2 bags into the truck bed himself. When the yard worker offered to help, thanked the man and did it himself anyway. He drove home, ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter, and then went out to walk the property, the way he did most afternoons. East fence line down behind the barn, to the creek along the creek, to the test plots where 6 experimental seed varieties grew in their labeled rows, smaller than the operation used to be, but not stopped because he was not sure he knew how to stop entirely. He stood at the edge of the south field and looked at the green rows of soybeans, coming in well in the good moisture year, and thought about Connor. He had not called, he would not call, not because he did not want to talk to his son. He thought about Connor more than Connor probably understood more than he had ever been good at expressing, but because asking for things, a direct personal kind of asking that required him to lay out a need and present it to someone and wait for an answer was not something Walter Gaines had ever learned to do with ease. He could negotiate a seed patent. He could ask for better terms on a materials bid. He could not quite ask his own son to come home. He stood in the field until the afternoon light began to angle, then walked back to the house. Connor pulled into the farm driveway on Friday just after noon in a rental car that looked wrong on the gravel, the way city things had always looked wrong on farm ground, too clean, too low, the wrong relationship to the surface it was moving on. Walter was on the porch. He had been there since 11, not because he knew Connor was coming. Frank had not told him, and Walter had not asked, but because the porch was where he sat in the afternoons, and the afternoon had arrived. He watched his son get out of the car. Connor was taller than Walter remembered noticing, built more like Eleanor's side of the family, long legs narrow through the shoulders, the posture of a man who had spent decades at desks and in conference rooms, slightly forward-leaning, even when standing still as if permanently prepared for the next meeting. He came across the yard with a bag over his shoulder and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They looked at each other across those few feet, and Walter felt the full accumulated weight of the years between visits and did not try to do anything with it. Some weights were not meant to be lifted immediately. They were meant to be acknowledged first. "Hey, Dad." Walter set his coffee on the railing. He stood up carefully, his right knee doing its usual morning theater, even though it was afternoon, and came down one step and put his arms around his son. Not a dramatic embrace, not the performance of reunion, just a hold steady specific, the kind of physical contact that says, "You are here, and I am here," and that is the whole point. Connor felt his father's bony shoulders through the flannel shirt, the roughness of the calloused hands pressed against his back. He had forgotten how thin his father had gotten, or perhaps he had never quite let himself notice. "I should have come sooner," Connor said. His voice was not quite steady. "You're here," Walter said. "That's enough." He held on for another few seconds, then stepped back and picked up his coffee from the railing. "Hungry?" he asked. "Yeah, actually, yeah." "Good. I made soup." They went inside. The kitchen was unchanged in every detail that mattered. Same table, same chairs, same window over the sink with the view of the garden and the field beyond it. Eleanor's apron still hung on the hook beside the stove, pale yellow, with a small embroidered chicken on the pocket that she had chosen herself and been quietly embarrassed about ever since, which was part of why she had never replaced it. Connor saw it and felt something tighten in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely just yet. Walter ladled soup into 2 bowls and set them on the table. They ate without much conversation, which had always been their way together, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them had ever been good at saying the important things over food in the middle of the day. Words for both of them came better when they were moving. After lunch, Walter took Connor outside. They walked the property together, and Walter pointed out the changes in the way of a man who has been in a place continuously and so registers only what has shifted. The repaired fence along the north line. The drainage work behind the barn that he had finally gotten done after 3 years of meaning to. The test plots along the creek smaller than they used to be, the labeled stakes still standing in their rows, with the careful handwritten notations that Connor remembered from childhood as something mysterious his father's scientific work that nobody at school had quite believed when Connor described it. "Frank told me about the bank," Connor said carefully as they walked. Walter nodded without looking at him. "News travels fast in this town. 11.8 million, Dad. Give or take. Your mother rounded up." Connor shook his head. "You drove the same truck. You wore the same." "Being rich never changed who we were," Walter said. "It just gave us more ways to help. That's what your mother always said, and she was right about it, the way she was right about most things." He paused at the edge of the south field, reached under his arm, and produced a folder he had been carrying since they left the house. He opened it on the hood of the truck and spread the sketches out. "This is what I'm building." Connor looked at the pages. Floor plans in his father's cramped, deliberate handwriting. Main hall with dimensions marked. Full kitchen. 2 meeting rooms. A storage area in the back corner, larger than you would expect. And off the main corridor, a small room labeled in pencil with letters pressed carefully into the paper, "Eleanor's reading room." Connor picked up that page and held it. He read the label twice. He set the page back down without saying anything because the label said what needed to be said better than any words he could add to it. "2 million from the trust," Walter said. "The fund documents are done. Construction starts this summer if the permits come through on schedule." He looked at his son. "I need someone to manage the project." Contracts budget, contractor coordination, the day-to-day oversight. I'm too old to run that on my own, and it's not what I know how to do. You know how to do it. Dad, I'm asking if you want to, not if you're capable. I know you're capable. Connor looked at his father, 78 years old, standing at the edge of a soybean field with architectural sketches spread on a truck hood, wearing the same kind of overalls he had worn Connor's entire life. Eleanor's glasses in his shirt pocket, asking for something in the way that Walter Gaines asked for things, which was to present the opportunity and leave the decision entirely to the other person. There's something I need to tell you first, Connor said. Walter waited. I'm in financial trouble. Real trouble. The real estate deal I told you it didn't work out. That wasn't the full picture. Connor stopped walking. He looked at the field rather than his father. I lost most of my savings. Most of what I'd built over 25 years. Collection notices, legal bills, credit shot. I couldn't afford a round-trip ticket to get here. He turned and looked at Walter directly. I bought a one-way. Walter was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the soybeans with the particular sound that wind makes through broad flat leaves, a gentle, continuous rustling that had been the ambient sound of Walter's life since before Connor was born. Why didn't you call me? No accusation in his voice, just the question, simple and direct. Because I was ashamed. Connor's voice was flat with the exhaustion of having held this for a long time. I left this place because I was ashamed of it. The farm, the truck, the small town life, the boots. I wanted something that looked like success from the outside. I built it and it turned out to be mostly surface. And then I lost even the surface. He met his father's eyes. You've been here the whole time with $11 million in the same boots you wore when I was in high school, planning to give away a fifth of it to a town of 2,000 people. And I couldn't manage my own savings account. Walter stopped walking. He turned to face his son. Connor, I don't care about the money. Yours or mine. Money is a tool. Your mother taught me that, and she was right. I know. What I care about is that you're standing here, in this field, with me. He paused. The money sorts itself out. Men who know how to work always find their footing. I've watched it happen enough times to believe it. Connor looked at him. So, Walter closed the folder and tucked it back under his arm. Do you want to manage this project? Yes, Connor said. Yeah, I want to. Walter nodded, the small, firm nod of a man closing an agreement. We'll start Monday. I'll introduce you to the architect on Tuesday. They turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. The afternoon light had gone gold and low across the field, stretching the soybean rows into long shadows. Connor walked beside his father and watched the ground and thought about the 30 years of Saturdays his father had driven this same road alone, in that same truck, and about how much distance can accumulate between two people who are not actually trying to be far from each other. Frank told me something else, Connor said when they were halfway back to the house. Walter did not answer, which with Walter meant go on. He said you kept a box, articles with my name in them, newsletters, award announcements, anything that mentioned me, that you printed things from the internet. Connor paused. That you figured out the search yourself. Wasn't complicated, Walter said. You never said a word to me about any of it in 30 years. Walter walked another few steps before he stopped and turned. Saying it wasn't how I was going to show it, he said simply. And that was all. Connor stood in the field in the late afternoon light and felt 30 years of misread distance reorganize itself into something he did not have a name for yet. Not forgiveness, they had not wronged each other in any single definable act. Something more like recognition. The belated understanding that the other person had been traveling the same road the whole time, just in a silence that looked from the outside like absence. He didn't say anything. Neither did Walter. They turned and walked back to the house together, this older man's gait deliberate and slightly stiff on his right side, the sun matching the pace without thinking about it, the way people do when they have walked beside someone they love. Back in the kitchen, Walter put the kettle on. Eleanor's apron hung on its hook. The folder of plans sat in the center of the table. Outside the window, the field lay flat and darkening in the last of the afternoon light, patient and unchanged, the same view it had been for 55 years. Ryan Caldwell arrived at the bank at 7:30 Monday morning, an hour before anyone else. He pulled up Walter's complete customer file, the full profile, every linked account, every document, every internal note, and read it in one uninterrupted sitting. The trust account, the mineral rights history, the seed patent, the royalty payment records. And at the top of the customer notes section, flagged in the bank's internal system by Margaret 3 years ago, a notation in her precise handwriting: priority client. Full review required before processing any transaction request. He had not read the notes. He had not read anything beyond the checking account balance. He sat in his empty office and looked at the screen and understood with the specific clarity of a professional confronting a professional failure that he had done the job incorrectly in a way that was not a close call or a matter of interpretation. He had looked at a man and seen only what he expected to see and had stopped looking there and had been wrong in a way that had mattered. He thought about his father, a mechanic in a town in central Ohio, not much different from Clover Falls in any way that counted. Oil-stained work shirts with his name stitched above the pocket. A pickup with rust along the wheel wells. Ryan had been embarrassed by his father as a teenager, had taken alternate routes to school, so his friends wouldn't see the shop with the old man's name on the sign, had never once told anyone in college what his father did for a living. His father had never mentioned any of it, had just kept working, kept paying the tuition bills, kept showing up with the same steadiness every morning. Ryan hadn't thought about that in years. That evening, he called his wife from the small apartment the bank was renting for him above the hardware store. He told her everything: the old farmer, the loan, the denial, the $14 in the checking account, what had appeared on Margaret's screen, the quiet way the man had walked out. His wife listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, and then she said, "Figure out what you owe and figure out how to pay it." He sat in the dark on the edge of the bed after she hung up and looked out the window at the empty main street. A dog crossed under the streetlight. The town was so quiet he could hear wind in the trees beyond the last building. Margaret knocked on his office door at 10 the next morning. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her and did not sit down. "I want to tell you about Walter Gaines," she said, "and I need you to actually listen." "I'm listening," Ryan said. "I've been at this bank since before you were in high school. I was here when Walter and Eleanor opened that trust. I watched Eleanor come in every month with a deposit, sometimes $50, sometimes $500, whatever they had left after the farm's expenses. I watched it grow from nothing to what you saw on Saturday." She paused. "Walter has never missed a tax payment in 55 years, never bounced a check, never asked for an extension, never requested a single favor he hadn't already earned 10 times over. He is the most reliable customer this institution has ever had." Ryan did not speak. "He didn't come in here to embarrass you," Margaret said. "That's not who he is. He came in to find out what kind of man was running the bank he's trusted for half a century. You showed him." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse than you already feel. I'm telling you because you need to understand what happened here before you can do anything useful about it." She left and closed the door quietly behind her. Ryan sat in his office for a long time after that and thought about his father and about the routes he had taken to school and about the man who had paid those tuition bills without ever once mentioning the sacrifice it represented. Ground broke on the first Monday in June. Connor was at the lot behind the post office at 6:45 in the morning with a clipboard he had put together the previous week, a hard hat he had bought from Frank's hardware store, and the particular focused energy of a man who has been given something real to organize after months of organizing nothing but the management of his own decline. Frank had laughed at the hard hat. Connor wore it throughout every day of the construction, partly out of principle and partly because it turned out he genuinely needed it twice. The lot had been cleared and leveled during the last week of May. The construction crew from Millhaven. 7-men family-owned operation, third generation, the kind of outfit that did not need to advertise because their previous work spoke clearly enough, began pouring the foundation on Tuesday morning. Connor had reviewed 4 separate bids, negotiated the selected contract down 11% through 2 rounds of back and forth that he had conducted with the calm precision of a man who had done this professionally for 20 years and built a payment schedule structured around the trust fund's quarterly disbursement cycle. He set up his office in a folding table at the edge of the lot with a laptop, a laminated copy of the site plan, and a schedule that accounted for weather delays, material lead times, and the particular unpredictability of construction work in a county where the soil conditions near old building footprints were always somewhat surprising. He held the first crew meeting at 7 on Wednesday morning and established three non-negotiable things: communication at the start of every problem. Not after it had grown, no changes to spec without his written approval, and the reading room in the back corner would be finished with the same quality and attention as the main hall, because that room was the reason the building existed. The crew foreman, a man named Desmond with 22 years of experience and the calm of someone who had worked for enough different clients to know which ones to take seriously, had listened to all 3 points and then said simply, "Understood," which was the right answer. Walter came every morning. He parked his truck at the edge of the lot and walked the perimeter slowly, hands clasped behind his back, Eleanor's glasses in his shirt pocket. He never told anyone what to do. He never offered opinions on technique or schedule. He just walked and looked and occasionally stopped at the orange flags marking the corners of what would eventually be Eleanor's reading room and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed as if doing something private and necessary, and then continued on. Nobody asked him what he was doing when he stopped at those flags. The crew had figured it out on their own by the end of the first week. Frank Hobson appeared at the chain-link fence most mornings by 8. He leaned on the top rail and observed the work with the critical eye of a man who had spent 4 decades surrounded by hardware and had opinions about the structural integrity of everything. "That pour looks shallow on the east wall," he said on the third day. "The engineer says it's within specification, Frank," Connor told him. "The engineer hasn't watched a basement flood in this county after a hard rain," Frank said. Connor added 2 inches to the pour specification. The engineer did not argue, having learned already that the project had a specific local gravity that superseded the strictly technical. Ryan Caldwell heard about the construction from Margaret during their end-of-week review in the second week of June. He drove past the lot on his way home and stopped the car and looked at the foundation work through the fence for several minutes. He drove home without getting out of the car. The following Wednesday, he walked into Ruth's Diner. Walter was at the counter, third stool coffee, eggs, not his usual Saturday, but he had been coming in on weekday mornings more often since the project started, something about the rhythm of the construction day pulling him into town earlier. Ruth poured without asking, set the cup down, and went to the far end of the counter, giving the space that the situation seemed to require. Ryan stood inside the door for a moment. He was wearing khakis and a button-down with no tie, which made him look different from the man behind the bank desk, less armored somehow. Smaller in a way that was not diminishment, but something closer to honesty. He walked to the counter and stopped 2 stools down from Walter. "Mr. Gaines." Walter turned his head. "Ryan, could I have a few minutes?" Walter looked at him for a long moment, the measuring look steady and without hostility, and then nodded toward the stool beside him. Ryan sat. Ruth brought a glass of water and moved away. 3 other customers in the diner, all of them watching without appearing to watch, in the way of people in small towns where the news travels faster than the events themselves. "I owe you an apology," Ryan said. "A real one. Not the kind where I say the correct words and expect things to rebalance themselves." He paused. "I looked at your account screen and made a judgment before you finished sitting down. I looked at your clothes and your age, and I stopped looking there. I didn't read your file. I didn't ask a single question that might have told me something true. That was wrong, and it was more than a procedural error. It was a failure to see you as a person." Walter drank his coffee. He listened. He waited until he was sure Ryan was finished before he spoke. "You remind me of someone I knew," Walter said. "A younger version of a particular kind of man. Too focused on what things cost to see what they're worth." He set his cup down. "My wife spent 50 years building something we never discussed in public. She had an accounting degree and the kind of patience that comes from understanding compound interest in your bones, knowing that the return on restraint is always larger than the return on spending. The lesson takes some people a while to find." Ryan took that without flinching. "I didn't walk into that bank because I needed $5,000, Walter said. He turned on the stool to face Ryan directly. "I walked in because I was about to put $2 million into this town, and I needed to know what kind of man was running the bank I'd been trusting for 50 years. I needed to see what you'd do. And I failed it. You failed the first one." Walter held his gaze. "Doesn't mean you can't pass the next." Ryan looked at him. "What do you mean?" I need someone to manage the fund's financial relationship with the bank. Disbursements, contractor payments, the accounting oversight for the construction fund. Margaret is retiring in the spring. I need someone at that institution who understands numbers and who is going to be in this town long enough for the understanding to mean something. He picked up his coffee. Connor runs the project side. He can walk you through the budget and the structure. You're asking me to manage the fund. I'm asking if you're willing to do the work because it matters to the people in this town, not because it looks good in a quarterly performance review. Yes, Ryan said, I'm willing. Good. Come to the site Friday. Connor will be there. Ryan stood. Thank you, Mr. Gaines. Walter. Thank you, Walter. He left the diner. Ruth waited until the door closed, then looked at Walter with the expression of a woman who has just witnessed something she will think about for a long time. You sure about him? No, Walter said. Eleanor always said you learn more about a man from what he does after a mistake than from the mistake itself. He ate a forkful of eggs. We'll find out. Ryan came to the site that Friday with a laptop and a folding chair he had carried from the bank. Connor walked him through the budget line by line across an afternoon that stretched to nearly 4 hours. By the end of it, Ryan had restructured the contractor payment schedule in a way that eliminated $11,000 in early disbursement fees, a reorganization that was technically simple once you saw it, but had required a thorough understanding of the fund's disbursement rules to find. Connor called Walter that evening. He's sharp, he said. He actually knows what he's doing. Walter said, I figured. Connor said, then why the test? And Walter said, knowing numbers isn't the same as seeing people. I needed to find out if he could do both. The weeks moved. The frame went up. The walls, the roof. People in town began appearing at the lot on weekends, not because anyone organized them or asked, but because the project had become something the whole town felt it had a stake in. A retired carpenter named Harold showed up on Tuesday mornings and worked until noon without needing to be invited. 3 women from the First Methodist Church organized themselves into a painting crew and tackled the interior walls of the meeting rooms with the efficient coordination of people who had been organizing church events together for 15 years. A farmer 2 roads over brought a flatbed load of lumber he had been saving for a barn expansion that had never materialized, just pulled up to the site one morning before the crew arrived, unloaded it himself, and drove away before Connor could catch him to say thank you properly. Frank stood at the fence every day. Looking good, he said, every single morning, without variation. You say that every day, Connor told him, because every day it gets a little more true, Frank said. And he was right, which was annoying. Ryan started coming to the site after work, still in his dress shirt, rolling the sleeves up, to carry boards or hold a level, or pour concrete into forms that needed filling before the end of the pour window. The crew had watched him with visible skepticism. In the first week, he was still in the town's collective memory, the banker who had turned Walter away, and that story was not going anywhere soon. But he kept showing up, day after day, week after week, doing whatever the site needed without asking for credit. And eventually the crew started handing him things without being asked, which is the closest thing to acceptance that a construction site offers. His wife Sarah came one Saturday with their daughter Lily, who was 5 years old, and immediately found a stack of scrap lumber near the fence and produced a marker from somewhere about her person and began drawing on the wood with the focused seriousness of an artist who has found the right medium. Sarah walked through the half-finished building with the observant eye of a woman who looked carefully at spaces and what they were designed to do. She stopped in the corner outside what would become Eleanor's reading room and stood there for a while. This is a good thing, she told Ryan that evening, standing in the parking lot while Lily drew on the back of the site plan. This is worth being here for. That night, Ryan called the regional office and asked about making his transfer permanent. The conversation with the regional manager took 20 minutes. At the end of it, Ryan had submitted the formal request. He did not tell anyone at the site for another week, and when he finally mentioned it to Connor, he said it the way people say things they have decided are not up for discussion, matter-of-fact, final moving on. Connor had looked at him for a moment and then said, good, and gone back to the punch list he was working through. In early October, on a quiet Thursday evening, Walter and Connor sat on the farmhouse porch after dinner. The air had gone cool enough to need a jacket. Crickets were working in the garden. Walter had made coffee, handed Connor a cup, and taken his chair, The one on the left, the one that had always been his. Eleanor's chair was on the right. It had always been there, always empty these past 2 years, and Connor had always felt its emptiness as a specific presence, rather than an absence, which was perhaps the truest thing about grief, that he had learned the shape of what is gone is as real as the shape of what remains. They sat in the quiet for a while. The field beyond the garden was dark, the harvest done weeks ago, the soil turned and waiting. Building's almost done, Walter said finally. 2 weeks at most. Inspector comes Monday. He paused. You've done good work, Connor. Your mother would have... He stopped, started again differently. It's good work. I had a good project, Connor said. They sat with the crickets for a while longer. Then Walter reached into his coat pocket, not the shirt pocket where he kept Eleanor's glasses, but the front pocket of his heavy canvas coat, a place Connor had never known him to keep anything, and held out his open palm. A ring, gold worn smooth from decades of wear, a small diamond that caught what little light came through the kitchen window behind them. Your mother's wedding ring, Walter said. She took it off during the treatments when her hands swelled, asked me to hold it for her. He paused. She told me to give it to you when the time was right. He held it out. I've been thinking about this for a while. I think this is the time. Connor looked at the ring in his father's palm before he reached for it. When he picked it up, it was lighter than he expected, warm from his father's pocket. He turned it in his fingers and felt the weight of 53 years of his parents' life together, compressed into something small enough to hold in one hand all the mornings, all the drives into town, all the deposits at the bank, all the hours his mother had spent at the kitchen table with her accounting books, and her careful columns of figures building something enormous without making a sound about it. She was proud of you, Walter said. She never stopped, not even during the years when the calls got less frequent. He paused. She understood why you left. She just wanted you to come back. Connor closed his hand around the ring. His jaw was tight, but he held steady. I'm staying, he said. Walter looked at him. I'm not going back to Columbus. There's nothing there that I need anymore. I want to stay and help run the center, be here, be part of this. He looked at his father. If that's what you want too. Walter was quiet for a long moment. He took a sip of coffee and looked out at the dark field with the patience of a man who has spent 55 years looking at fields and trusts that they will be there when he looks back. Good, he said. I could use the company. Connor slipped Eleanor's ring into his shirt pocket. He did not think about which pocket. It was just where his hand went, and it felt right. They sat on the porch and listened to the crickets and did not need to say anything else. Inside the kitchen, visible through the window, the folder of plans lay open on the table, its pages covered now in 2 sets of handwriting. Walter's cramped, precise letters on the original sketches, Connor's neat printed notes in the margins, months of work, layered together across the pages of a building that was almost finished in a town that had already begun to change. The Eleanor Gaines Memorial Community Center opened on the second Saturday in November. It stood on the lot behind the post office where weeds and crabgrass had grown for 4 years behind a sagging fence. It was larger than the old building, taller with broad windows along the south and east walls that brought the morning light into every room in a way that made the spaces feel inhabited even before anyone was inside them. The wood floors were sourced from a mill 2 counties over at Connor's insistence because he had learned from 20 years of project management that the materials that last are the ones chosen with some care about lasting. The built-in bookshelves in Eleanor's reading room had been crafted by hand from reclaimed oak by a woodworker from the north part of the county who had donated the work entirely, showing up one morning with his tools in his truck and spending 3 weeks on the shelving without discussing payment. Connor had been at the building since 6 in the morning, checking everything he had checked 3 times already, pacing the rooms, testing door handles, confirming with the caterers, speaking with the piano tuner who arrived at 8:30 and spent an hour with the upright piano the elementary school music teacher had donated. By 9, the main hall was set with white tablecloths and trays of food contributed by 3 different establishments in the county, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee and the particular warmth of a building full of prepared food made the whole place feel like what it was supposed to be. Frank arrived at 9:15 and stood in the main doorway for a moment looking at the space. Not bad, he said finally. Connor set down his clipboard. Frank, you have said some version of that every single day for 4 months. Because every single day it got a little more true, Frank said. And today it's considerably more true than yesterday. He walked in and found himself a chair near the front of the main hall and sat down and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has watched something come from nothing and is taking a moment to properly appreciate having seen it. People began arriving before 10. Cars lined both sides of the street, 2 blocks in each direction. Families came through the front entrance and stopped just inside the door to look at the space, the height of the ceiling, the light through the south windows, the wood floors, the clean white walls, and the looking on their faces was the particular looking of people who are recognizing something they have been missing without quite knowing what it was. Children discovered immediately that the hallway floors were excellent for sliding in socked feet. The building filled with the sound of people who had not had a place like this in 4 years and were rediscovering what it felt like to be gathered. Walter parked in the back lot at 10:30. He sat in the truck cab and did not move for a moment. He reached into his shirt pocket and held Eleanor's glasses in both hands. The wire frames were cool from the morning air. The scratch on the left lens caught a small fragment of light. He held them and thought about the morning 2 years ago when he had found them on her nightstand and understood what their presence there meant, and about every morning since when he had put them in his pocket and carried them through whatever the day required. "We did it, Ellie," he said quietly. He sat for another moment. Then he put the glasses back in his pocket and got out of the truck. He walked around to the front entrance slowly in no hurry. Above the main door, mounted the day before by the woodworker who had made the bookshelves, a dark walnut plaque had been installed. Hand-carved, clean, well-proportioned lettering. It read Eleanor Gaines Memorial Community Center. A town is only as strong as its kindest people. Walter stood below it and read the words twice. Connor had found the quote in a letter Eleanor had written to the county paper in 2001, a response to a discussion about budget cuts to the school district. She had been characteristically precise and practical in the letter, making her argument with numbers and specific examples, and at the end, she had written that sentence as a kind of summary, the way she sometimes arrived at a plain statement of something she had been thinking about for a long time. Connor had found the letter in the folder of Eleanor's printers that Walter kept in the desk drawer upstairs. He had read it through twice and then called Walter and asked if he could use it. Walter had said yes without needing to think about it. Seeing it now carved into wood above a door his wife had dreamed about for years, Walter's chest went tight in a way that surprised him. He had thought he was prepared for today. He was not quite as prepared as he thought. He went inside. The main hall was full, more than 100 people perhaps, considerably more. It was hard to count in a moving crowd filling the chairs, standing along the walls, overflowing into the corridor, and the kitchen and the meeting rooms. The feeling in the room was different from the town meeting months ago. That had been surprise and emotion and the particular rawness of people confronting something unexpected. This was celebration. Warm, loud, genuine, full of laughter and the sound of children and the overlapping conversations of people who are happy to be in the same place at the same time. Connor guided Walter to the small podium set up at the front of the main hall. Walter had told him twice he did not want a microphone. Connor had set one up anyway. Walter stood at the podium and did not touch the microphone. The room went quiet on its own in about 10 seconds, the way rooms go quiet for people who do not demand quiet, but simply wait for it. "I'm not going to talk long," he said. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted that. She'd have wanted the food hot and the kids doing something. A few people laughed, the warm, recognizing laugh of people who knew Eleanor and knew this was true. This building exists because of her. She dreamed about it for years, talked about it on drives into town, talked about it at the kitchen table, talked about it in the hospital when talking at all was hard. The room went very still. Eleanor believed a town wasn't just a place where people happened to live near each other. She said it was a place where people looked after each other, where somebody's trouble became everybody's concern, where people showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He paused. His hand moved briefly to the glasses in his shirt pocket, then came back to his side. "She was the best person I ever knew. 53 years she spent making me better than I would have been on my own. When she asked me to build this place, I told her I would." He looked out at the room. "So here it is." He stepped back from the podium. The room rose. The applause was immediate and whole, the kind that means something real, where people put their hands up without being conscious of the gesture, where the sound fills the room completely, and you can feel it as much as hear it. People were on their feet everywhere along the walls in the back corridor in the doorway to the kitchen. Frank sat in the front row and did not clap. He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and nodded once slowly and deliberately in the way of a man confirming something to himself that he has long known but is glad to see proven. When the applause settled, Connor stepped to the podium. "We have someone who'd like to help us open this place properly," he said. "Some of you know her." Sophie Dawson walked to the front of the room. 12 years old, tall for her age, dark hair in a ponytail, carrying herself with the particular composure of a child who has learned early that the world can be frightening and has decided to meet it anyway. She sat down at the upright piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. Ruth stood near the back of the room, both hands pressed together against her mouth. Her eyes were already wet. Sophie began to play. A simple piece, not simple as in easy, but simple as in clear. Each note placed with the deliberate care of someone who has spent a lot of time learning that music, like most things worth doing, does not benefit from hurrying. The melody moved through the room, and the room listened in the particular way of people who have been given something unexpected and are trying to receive it properly. 5 years ago, Sophie Dawson had been in a hospital bed with numbers attached to her that the doctors delivered carefully in the way doctors learn to deliver numbers that have weight. The treatments had been long and uncertain, and had worked eventually in the way that uncertain things sometimes work when you do not stop. Ruth had worked double shifts and sold her car and borrowed from her sister and still fallen behind the bills in ways that seemed to outrun everything she could do. And then one day the billing office had called, and the woman on the phone had been kind and professional and final, and the balance was zero, and Ruth had spent 5 years with a gratitude that had nowhere to land. She stood at the back of the room now and watched her daughter play piano on a stage in a building that had been built by the man who had paid those bills, and she let the tears come without trying to stop them. She stood there and held on to the moment with everything she had. When Sophie finished, the room applauded again. The girls smiled, not a performer's smile, but the real one, the smile of someone who has done something and is genuinely glad it went well, and walked back to her mother. Ruth put her arm around her daughter and held her close and did not let go for a long time. Walter watched them from across the room. Ruth looked up. Across the crowd, across the heads of all the people between them, she found him. She held his gaze for a moment. There was a question in her eyes that had been waiting 5 years for this moment, and she let him see it. Walter looked back at her steadily. He did not nod. He did not confirm anything in words or visible gesture. He simply looked at her with the same quiet openness that he brought to everything. And after a moment, something in her face settled not into certainty exactly, but into a place beyond the need for certainty. Some things do not require confirmation. They only need to be seen, and then they can be set down. Ruth pressed her lips together. She nodded once to herself or to the room or to something only she could name. Then she turned back to her daughter and held her closer. The celebration spread through the building. People explored the rooms, the kitchen, the meeting spaces, the storage area that was already being claimed by 3 different organizations who had been running programs out of cramped, borrowed spaces for 4 years. A group of children found Eleanor's reading room in the back corner, with its built-in oak shelves already half filled with donated books, and 2 girls immediately sat down on the floor and pulled books into their laps and began reading with the focused indifference of children who, when they find something they want, do not see why they should wait. Marcus Ryan arrived with Sarah and Lily around mid-morning. They came through the front entrance together, Ryan carrying Lily on his hip, and some people in the crowd nodded at them, and some looked away because the town had not entirely resolved what it thought about the banker and the loan, and probably never would fully resolve it. But most people had also watched Ryan at the construction site for 4 months, carrying boards and bringing coffee in the cold mornings, and doing the work without asking for recognition, and that counted for something in a town where you could watch a person for 4 months without much interference. Sarah walked through the building slowly and carefully, the way she looked at everything, and stopped in the main hall and watched the crowd for a while. "You were right to stay," she said to Ryan. He nodded. Their daughter squirmed down from his arms and ran toward the sound of the children in the reading room. Ryan watched her go and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since April. In the early afternoon, Ryan found Walter in Eleanor's reading room, standing near the window where the winter light came in and fell across the oak shelves in warm rectangles. The two girls who had been reading earlier were still there, moved now to the window seat that the woodworker had built into the south wall, their books open, completely unaware of the adult occasion continuing in the next room. Walter. Ryan stood in the doorway. Walter turned. Ryan came in and extended his hand. Thank you for the second chance, for the trust with the fund, with all of it. He paused. I didn't deserve it. No, Walter agreed. You didn't. But deserving isn't always the point. He took Ryan's hand, not the quick professional grip of a banking transaction, but a full firm hold, the handshake of two people who have gotten somewhere from a bad start. Earning is the point. You've been doing that. Ryan nodded. He understood that this was as close to settled as things would get, and that settled was enough. Your daughter seems happy, Walter said. Ryan looked through the doorway toward the sounds coming from the main hall where Lily had apparently found the other children and integrated herself into whatever they were doing with the effortless speed of 5-year-olds. She keeps asking when we're officially moving here, he said. Smart girl, Walter said. Ryan smiled, small, the smile of a man who is beginning to understand where he is. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned to the people who did not want to leave, and the caterers were packing up the trays and the children's drawings taped to the wall by the door, made during an impromptu session that someone had organized with butcher paper and markers, apparently without anyone planning it, were starting to curl at the edges. Walter and Frank found themselves in folding chairs in the corner of the main hall, with paper plates on the table in front of them and coffee that had been hot an hour ago. Frank leaned back and looked at the ceiling. She would have loved this, he said. Walter reached into his pocket and touched the glasses briefly, then left his hand at rest. She would have been in the kitchen, making sure nobody ran out of food, he said, and she would have made too many pies. She always made too many pies. She didn't think there was such a thing as too many pies. She was right about that, Frank said. She was right about most things. They sat for a while. Connor came through carrying a stack of empty trays toward the kitchen, caught his father's eye, gave a small wave and kept moving. Sophie and two other girls ran through the hall, all three of them laughing at something private and complete, and the sound of it bounced off the new walls and filled the room in a way that made the room feel like what it was meant to be. He's staying, Frank said, watching the door Connor had gone through. He's staying. Good. Frank nodded. He looked around the room, the tables, the chairs, the banner. Someone had made the children's drawings on the wall, the plaque above the main door visible from where they sat with Eleanor's words carved into it. Good boy. He's 49, Frank. Still a good boy. Walter almost smiled. He looked at the plaque. He had heard Eleanor say those words dozens of times over 53 years, and each time she had meant them as a statement of fact rather than aspiration. Not a wish for how things should be, but an observation about how communities actually sustain themselves. The kindest people were not in Eleanor's understanding the ones who were kind when it was convenient or comfortable. They were the ones who showed up, who paid the bill that nobody else was going to pay, who built the building that nobody else had gotten around to building, who carried the glasses of a person they missed every day and kept driving the same road and farming the same ground because the road and the ground were where they had built everything worth having. He had promised her in October in a hospital room holding her hand while the light came in low through the window and she was having one of the clear days. He had promised without hesitation because there was never any question of not keeping it, only of finding the right moment to begin. It had taken him 2 years. A denied loan, an $11 million secret on a teller's screen, a son who came home with nothing but his own humility and turned out to be exactly what the project needed, a banker who failed his first test and showed up every day after that to earn a second one. That was what it had taken. Walter wouldn't have done it any other way. Connor came out of the kitchen and pulled a folding chair up beside his father. Building held up fine for its first day, he said. Give it a week, Frank said. The plumbing will start its complaints. You say that about every building in this county, Frank. Because every building in this county has eventually proven me right. Connor laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind he had not had much access to in the past year. Walter shook his head. Frank grinned. The three of them sat as the last of the daylight came gold through the south windows, and moved slowly across the floor in long rectangles that reached almost to the center of the room before the sun dropped below the building line and the light went. Two old men and one middle-aged man in a new building named after a woman who would have been in the next room at this hour making sure the coffee was still hot, and the children had eaten something, and everyone who came through the door felt like they had come to the right place. After a while, Walter stood. "I'm heading home," he said. "Want me to drive you?" Connor asked, standing. "It's getting dark, Dad." "I've been driving that road in the dark for 55 years. I think I can manage one more time." Connor looked at him for a moment and then sat back down because in the past months, he had learned that arguing with Walter about practical things was roughly as productive as arguing with weather. The weather made its own decisions. Walter shook Frank's hand, a firm hold held for a beat longer than necessary, the grip of two men who have been friends for long enough that the grip means something beyond greeting. He put his hand on Connor's shoulder and pressed once briefly, and Connor put his own hand over his father's for a moment. Then Walter walked through the building past the empty chairs and the tables still scattered with paper plates, past the reading room, where the oak shelves caught the last of the afternoon light, past the kitchen, where the caterers were loading the last of their equipment, and out the back door to the parking lot. The lot was mostly empty. His truck and two other cars, the caterer's van engine running. The air outside was cold and clean, smelling of dry leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney on the street behind the lot, and the particular cold earth smell of Kansas in November that Walter had been breathing his entire life. He climbed into the cab and sat there. Through the rearview mirror, he could see the back of the building. The new brick clean and pale in the fading light, the windows still lit from inside figures moving past the glass. Dale, Connor, and Frank probably finishing the cleanup, talking to the last few people who hadn't wanted to leave. He started the engine. It coughed twice, turned over, settled. He pulled out of the lot and drove east out of town on the same road he had driven every Saturday for 31 years, the same road he had driven home from the bank in April when the story began. The fields stretched out on both sides of the highway, flat and bare. The soybeans had been harvested weeks ago, and the soil was dark and turned and waiting for winter the way fields wait, without impatience, without opinion, simply ready for whatever the season required. Bare now but not empty, full of everything that was coming next. Same road, same truck, same man in the same seat. But the passenger side felt different tonight. Not the particular ache of absence that had lived there for 2 years, the ache of a space that was supposed to be occupied and wasn't. Something quieter than that, something that had been set down and did not need to be picked back up. He turned onto the gravel drive. The farmhouse appeared in the headlights, white paint, green shutters, the porch and its two chairs, Eleanor's garden covered in mulch and ready for spring. He parked and turned off the engine and sat in the dark cab for a moment, listening to the cooling engine tick. He got out and stood in the yard, wind in the walnut tree, a dog barking somewhere down the road growing fainter, the last strip of pale color above the western tree line almost gone. He stood and breathed the cold air and felt the farm around him the way he always felt it, not as property or acreage or a collection of assets and resources, but as a place, the specific place where his life had happened, where he had built everything worth having with the woman whose glasses he carried in his shirt pocket. He walked up the porch steps, stopped for a moment at Eleanor's chair, did not touch it, just stood beside it for a moment, as he did sometimes, and then went inside. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. He turned on the light over the table. The folder of plans was still there where it had been since April, its pages worn at the corners from handling, covered in 2 sets of handwriting now. He stood at the table and looked at it. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out Eleanor's glasses. The wire frames, the scratch on the left lens, the replaced nose pad on the right side. He held them for a moment, the familiar weight, the familiar coolness of the wire against his palms. He had carried them through the bank, through the town meeting, through 4 months of construction, through every morning walk around the building site, through every quiet evening on the porch, through every conversation and every decision and every moment when he had needed to know what Eleanor would have thought. He set them down on the kitchen table, gently, not in a drawer, not put away, not finished with, not gone, just placed down next to the folder of plans in the spot where Eleanor used to sit at the kitchen table, When she was working through her accounting books in the evenings, her own glasses on her nose, the pencil moving steadily across the page. He put the kettle on. He sat down in his chair. He looked out the window at the dark fields. The coffee was ready in a few minutes, and he held the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through his palms. Outside, the fields lay quiet under the November sky, the same 400 acres they had always been patient, unchanged, waiting for spring, full of everything the next season would bring. He did not say anything to Eleanor tonight. He didn't need to. She already knew.